The wind in Bridger's Gap had a personality, a moody, persistent one that scoured the paint from houses and pushed tumbleweeds across the cracked asphalt of Main Street. It was a constant reminder that this town was an outpost, a stubborn collection of buildings pressed between the vast, undulating plains and the stark, imposing shadow of the Wolf-Tooth Mountains. For Clara Evans, the wind was the town's heartbeat, sometimes a gentle sigh, other times a furious roar. Today, it was a low, mournful whistle as she pushed a squeaky cart down the aisle of the Big T supermarket, the only grocery store for 30 miles. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, buzzing glow on the stacked cans of beans and corn. The air smelled of refrigerated air, cardboard, and the faint, sweet scent of overripe melons. It was a place of routine, of quiet transactions and mumbled pleasantries. But beneath the surface, Bridger's Gap simmered. It was a border town in every sense of the word, bordering the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Two communities existed side by side, sharing a zip code but little else. A fragile peace was maintained by unspoken rules, averted gazes, and a deep, historical chasm of mistrust that the wind couldn't blow away. Clara, a middle school history teacher who had moved here 2 years ago seeking refuge from the city's relentless noise, was still learning the town's silent language. She saw it in the way the cashier, a tired-looking woman named Darlene, would tense up when a tribal family came to her line. She heard it in the grumbles at the diner about land rights and water access. She was an outsider to both communities, a neutral observer in a quiet, undeclared war. She rounded the corner into the snack aisle, looking for the specific brand of crackers her students loved, when she heard the voice. It was thick with resentment, a gravelly baritone that cut through the store's low hum. "You'd think they'd teach you to keep your hands to yourself," the voice said. "Always grabbing, always taking." Clara froze, her hand hovering over a box of saltines. A few feet away stood Jed Miller, a rancher whose face was a permanent roadmap of sun and scowls. He was a big man, built solid from a life of hard labor, and he loomed over a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. The boy had beautiful, long black hair tied back in a neat braid, and he was clutching a small, brightly colored bag of chips. Standing protectively beside him was an old man, his grandfather by the look of him. The elder's face was a stunning landscape of deep-set wrinkles, his eyes dark and calm, holding a stillness that seemed to absorb the world around him. "He was just looking," the old man said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of decades. "Looking with his fingers," Jed sneered, his eyes flicking from the boy to the grandfather. He gestured vaguely at a slightly disheveled stack of chip bags. "Your kind is all the same. No respect for other people's property." The boy, Kai, shrank back, pressing himself against his grandfather's leg. His eyes were wide, a mix of fear and defiance. The grandfather, Tahi, placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. He didn't raise his voice or rise to the bait. He simply stood his ground, a silent, dignified mountain against Jed's blustering storm. Clara's heart began to pound against her ribs. She looked around. A woman further down the aisle quickly steered her cart away, pretending to be intensely interested in a display of pasta sauce. The teenage stock boy suddenly found a reason to disappear into the back room. Darlene, at the front checkout, stared fixedly at her register screen. No one was going to do anything. This was one of the unspoken rules: don't get involved. Jed took a half-step closer, his bulk seeming to suck the air out of the aisle. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or you just forget how to speak English when it suits you?" That was it. The casual, cruel dehumanization of it all snapped something inside Clara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a hot, fierce wave of indignation. She thought of her students, of the lessons she taught about justice, courage, and standing up for what is right. What kind of teacher would she be if she turned her back now? She cleared her throat, her own voice sounding foreign and too loud in the tense silence. "He said the boy was just looking." Jed's head swiveled toward her, his eyes, small and hard, narrowed. "This ain't your business, school teacher." Clara pushed her cart forward a few feet, creating a flimsy barrier between herself and him. She kept her gaze steady, her hands gripping the plastic handle so tightly her knuckles were white. "You're harassing a child and his grandfather in a public place. I think that makes it everyone's business." Jed let out a short, humorless laugh. "Harassing? I'm just speaking the truth." He looked past her, trying to rally the invisible, silent audience. "They come in here, get their government handouts, and act like they own the place." "That's enough, Jed," Clara said, her voice dropping, gaining an authority she didn't know she possessed. "You're making a scene. Go pay for your things and leave them alone." For a moment, a flicker of genuine shock crossed his face. People didn't talk to Jed Miller like that, especially not a transplant from the city. He seemed to weigh his options, his jaw working as he glared at her. The potential for a real, ugly escalation hung heavy in the air. But something in her unwavering stare, in the simple, direct challenge, seemed to deflate him. It wasn't fear of her, but perhaps the sheer, unexpected inconvenience of it. With a final, disgusted grunt, he turned on his heel. "Whatever," he muttered, grabbing his own items and stalking off toward the front of the store, his boots thudding angrily on the linoleum. Silence descended on the aisle once more, but it was a different kind of silence. The tension had broken, leaving a shaky, uncertain calm. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak. She finally looked at the old man and the boy. Kai was peeking out from behind his grandfather, his dark eyes fixed on her with a look of quiet awe. The grandfather, Tahi, met her gaze directly. He didn't offer a word of thanks, no grand platitude. Instead, he gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. It was a look of acknowledgement, of deep, profound recognition. In his ancient eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but an understanding that passed between them. An understanding that she had crossed a line, not just for them, but for herself. He gently guided the boy away, picking up the bag of chips Kai had dropped and placing it in their small basket. They moved toward the checkout, their dignity intact. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her heart still hammering. She watched them pay and walk out the automatic doors, disappearing into the vast, windswept landscape. As the doors slid shut, she was left alone in the humming fluorescent light. The single, clear image of the old man's nod burned into her mind. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the store's air conditioning. She had won a small victory, but in a town like Bridger's Gap, she knew every action had an echo. Sleep offered Clara no escape. It was a restless, shallow sea of anxiety, and she washed ashore before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed a merciless 4:37 a.m. The silence of her small rental house on the edge of Bridger's Gap was usually a comfort, but now it felt fragile, a thin membrane easily punctured by the memory of Jed Miller's face, contorted with vitriol. Every creak of the old house settling, every distant rumble of a truck on the highway, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She lay in bed, tracing the water stains on the ceiling, replaying the scene at the grocery store. Had she been reckless? Had her flash of courage been nothing more than naive arrogance? Bridger's Gap was a town that ran on unspoken rules, and she had shattered one of the most fundamental: don't get involved. She imagined the phone calls already being made, the story twisting and hardening as it passed from one person to the next. That new teacher, the one from out of state, she made a scene. Sided with them against one of our own. The thought made her stomach clench. She was an outsider by geography, but now she feared she'd become an outcast by choice. Finally abandoning any hope of more sleep, she swung her legs out of bed. The floorboards were cold against her bare feet. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, a ghost in her own home. She made coffee, the aroma usually a small, daily pleasure, but today it did nothing to cut through the bitter taste of fear in her mouth. Standing at her kitchen window, she looked out over her small, frost-covered yard toward the street. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains still dark silhouettes against the coming dawn. A pair of headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, slowing as they approached her street. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She instinctively stepped back from the window, her mind screaming, "It's him. It's Jed." She held her breath as the vehicle, a large Ford pickup just like Jed's, turned the corner. It continued past her house without slowing and disappeared down the road. Clara exhaled, a shaky, shuddering breath, her hands trembling so much she had to set her coffee mug down on the counter. She couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows. She had to go to school. Hiding would be an admission of guilt, of fear. It would give them a victory she refused to hand over. Squaring her shoulders, she finished getting ready, choosing her clothes like armor, simple, professional, unremarkable. She wanted to be invisible today, to fade into the background of chalk dust and textbooks. As she gathered her bag, a low, rhythmic sound began to permeate the quiet of her house. It was a sound that didn't belong to the morning symphony of Bridger's Gap. It wasn't a truck or a tractor. It was softer, more organic. A dull, collective thudding. It grew steadily louder, closer. Curiosity warred with a fresh spike of fear. She crept to her living room window, peering cautiously through the blinds, and her blood ran cold. They were coming down her street. Not in trucks, but on foot and on horseback. A long, silent procession of men from the reservation. There were dozens of them, stretching farther down the road than she could see. Young men with stony faces sat atop sturdy horses, their presence radiating a quiet intensity. Older men, their faces etched with the lines of hard lives and resilience, walked with a steady, unhurried pace. At the very front of the procession walked Tahi, the old man from the store. He wore a simple flannel jacket and jeans, but he moved with the dignity of a king. He was not looking at her house, not yet, but straight ahead, his purpose a palpable force. Clara stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. This was it, retaliation, but not from Jed. From them? Had she offended them? Had her intervention been seen as the condescension of a white woman, an insult to their pride? Maybe they didn't want or need her help. Her mind, already primed for disaster, spiraled. She was alone. No one would help her. The whole town would watch from behind their own curtains, feeling vindicated. Her hand fumbled for her phone, but who would she call? The sheriff? What would she say? There are native men walking down my street? She would sound hysterical, paranoid. She was trapped. The procession stopped. The rhythmic sound ceased, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. They had arranged themselves in a loose, semicircular formation in front of her small property, lining the street and the edge of her yard. They were utterly still, their collective gaze fixed on her house. They weren't yelling or brandishing weapons. They were just there, waiting. The stillness was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Clara's back was pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. Through the gap in her blinds, she saw Tahi take a single step forward. He met her gaze, as if he could see her through the walls and the window. He held it for a long moment, his expression unreadable but intense. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the same nod from the grocery store, but now it was magnified by the silent assembly behind him. Beside him, the boy, Kai, stepped forward. He walked right up to her porch steps, his small frame looking even smaller surrounded by the stoic men. He hesitated for a second, then carefully placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on the top step. He didn't run back, but walked calmly to his grandfather's side. Tahi gave one last look at her front door, then turned. As if from a single, unspoken command, the entire procession turned with him. The men on foot began their steady walk back the way they came. The riders gently nudged their horses, falling in behind them. There was no noise, no fanfare, just a quiet, dignified, and unbelievably powerful departure. Clara remained frozen against the wall until the last man had disappeared around the corner. The street was empty again. The only evidence they had ever been there was the small bundle on her porch. Trembling, she forced herself to move, unlocking her front door and stepping out into the crisp morning air. She picked up the object. Unwrapping the worn cloth, she found a hand-carved wooden hawk, its wings outstretched, its eyes meticulously detailed. It was a simple thing, yet it felt heavy in her hands, weighted with a meaning that left her breathless. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a thank you. It was a shield. 70 warriors hadn't come to her house to menace her. They had come to stand guard, to return the favor, to show the entire town of Bridger's Gap that the quiet schoolteacher was not alone. The silence that followed the procession was heavier than the one during it. As the dust settled on the empty street, Clara stood in her doorway, the small, smooth carving of a hawk clutched in her hand. Its wooden form was surprisingly weighty, a tangible anchor to the morning's surreal events. The initial wave of terror had long since receded, replaced by a profound, trembling awe. They hadn't come to threaten. They had come to honor, to protect. But as the sun climbed higher, casting the long shadows of the Beartooth Mountains over the valley, a new, cold reality began to seep in. Protection from one side of the divide was seen as a provocation by the other. Bridger's Gap wasn't a big town. News, especially news as visual as 70 silent warriors lining a street, traveled faster than a prairie fire. When Clara finally convinced herself to leave the house, needing to pick up some groceries she'd forgotten during yesterday's turmoil, the change was palpable. It wasn't overt aggression. It was worse. It was a quiet, collective turning of backs. At the Gapper's Grill, the usual hub of morning coffee and gossip, conversations didn't just quiet when she walked in, they stopped dead. Eyes that would normally offer a polite nod now slid away, finding intense interest in coffee cups or the cracks in the linoleum floor. The air thickened with unspoken accusations. She was the one who had stirred the pot. She was the one who had brought the reservations, simmering tensions to a boil right on their main street. She saw Jed Miller holding court in a corner booth, surrounded by other ranchers in dusty jeans and worn flannel shirts. He wasn't yelling. He was speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone, but his gestures were large and agitated. He jabbed a finger in her direction, his face a mask of aggrieved indignation. She couldn't hear the words, but she could piece them together from the hostile glares that were sent her way. Troublemaker, Indian lover, doesn't know her place. Clara's stomach twisted. She abandoned her grocery list, grabbed a carton of milk from the cooler, paid in cash to a cashier who refused to meet her gaze, and fled back into the harsh sunlight. Her sanctuary, her small rented house, no longer felt safe. It felt like a stage. She imagined eyes on her from every window on the street, judging, watching. The carved hawk on her kitchen table seemed to mock her with its stoic nobility. It was a promise of protection, but that promise had also painted a target on her back. Her phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. It was Principal Henderson from the elementary school. His voice, usually a warm and slightly harried baritone, was tight and formal. "Clara, could you come down to the school, please? There are a few things we need to discuss." It wasn't a request. An hour later, she was sitting in the worn visitor's chair opposite his large, cluttered desk. Mr. Henderson, a man whose defining characteristic was a desire to avoid conflict at all costs, was fidgeting with a pen. He cleared his throat. "Clara," he began, failing to meet her eyes. "I've been getting calls, a lot of them, from parents." "About what?" Clara asked, though she knew the answer. "About what happened this morning, about what happened at the market yesterday." He finally looked at her, his expression a weary mix of frustration and appeal. "People are concerned. They're saying you're bringing outside politics into the community, into the school." Jed Miller's wife, Sarah, called. She said Jed felt threatened, said you instigated the whole thing. Clara's jaw tightened. "I defended a child, Mr. Henderson. A child from our community who was being verbally assaulted by a grown man. Is that a political act? When it results in a demonstration like the one this morning, people see it that way," he sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, I understand your intentions were good, but we have a delicate balance here in Bridger's Gap. We have to coexist. What you did, what they did, it upset that balance. People are scared. They saw that procession as a threat." "It wasn't a threat," Clara said, her voice low but firm. "It was the opposite. It was a thank you. It doesn't matter what it was." It matters what it looked like, he countered, his voice rising slightly. The school board is concerned. Parents are threatening to pull their kids from your class. They don't want their children taught by someone they see as an agitator. The word hung in the air between them. Agitator? It was a label meant to strip her actions of their morality, to turn her into a problem to be solved. What are you asking me to do, Mr. Henderson? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a placating hush. I think a simple apology might go a long way. A public statement. Clarify that it was a misunderstanding, that you regret how things escalated. Just something to smooth things over, to show you're committed to the peace of this town. Clara stared at him. He wanted her to apologize for defending a child. He wanted her to invalidate the profound, powerful gesture of gratitude she had received, to call it a misunderstanding for the comfort of those who chose to see it as a threat. He wanted her to choose the fragile, unjust piece of Bridger's gap over the simple, human decency she had shown. The carved hawk on her table flashed in her mind's eye, a symbol of fierce, unwavering integrity. She stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. No, she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the fear that had plagued her all day. I will not apologize for that. Not now, not ever. Mr. Henderson looked stunned, then defeated. Clara, you have to understand the position you're putting me in, the position you're putting yourself in. I understand it perfectly, she replied, turning and walking toward the door. As she stepped out of his office and into the empty school hallway, the isolation was complete. She was an island. But for the first time since yesterday, she felt the solid ground of her own conviction beneath her feet. The cost of her stand was becoming terrifyingly clear, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The official letter arrived 2 days later. It wasn't slid under her door or left in her mailbox, but delivered by a courier from the county office, a stoic man who insisted she sign for it. The crisp, thick envelope felt heavy in Clara's hand, a physical manifestation of the dread that had been coiling in her stomach since her meeting with Principal Thompson. Inside, the language was cold, sterile, and brutally efficient. It informed her of a mandatory disciplinary hearing before the Bridger's Gap School Board. The charge: conduct detrimental to the school's mission and its relationship with the community. The date was set for the following Tuesday. Clara dropped the letter onto her small kitchen table, the paper landing next to the carved wooden hawk. For a moment, she just stared at the two objects, a stark contrast between bureaucratic condemnation and silent, stoic support. The town had drawn its line in the sand, and she was standing on the wrong side of it. Her refusal to apologize hadn't been a negotiation tactic. It had been the pulling of a pin from a grenade. Now, she was simply waiting for the explosion. The days leading up to the hearing were a masterclass in isolation. At school, her colleagues avoided her gaze, conversations falling silent when she entered the staff room. Her students, perceptive as children are, felt the tension. They were more subdued, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a watchful quiet. It was as if she were already a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. The ostracism was no longer just cold shoulders in the grocery store. It was a systematic erasure from the town's social fabric. One evening, driven by a flicker of pragmatism, she looked up local lawyers. The first one she called, a man whose office was just off Main Street, cut her off halfway through her explanation. I'm sorry, Miss Evans, but my docket is full. And frankly, a dispute with the school board, that's a tough one to win around here. The second call was even shorter, a polite but firm declination. She didn't try a third time. They all knew each other. They were members of the same clubs, their children played on the same sports teams, and they likely sat in the same pews on Sunday. Jed Miller's roots in this valley ran deep. Hers were barely in the ground. On Sunday afternoon, the day before the hearing, a profound sense of defeat settled over her. She sat on her front porch swing, the late autumn air crisp with the promise of an early winter. The mountains stood impassive in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first snow. It was a beautiful, lonely vista. She was thinking of packing, of where she might go next, when a dusty, dark green pickup truck, a model at least 2 decades old, slowed and pulled over in front of her house. It was a vehicle she recognized from the reservation, but it wasn't one of the ones from the procession. A man got out of the driver's side. He was younger than the men who had stood vigil, perhaps in his late 20s, with long black hair tied back in a neat ponytail. He wore jeans, work boots, and a simple canvas jacket. He moved with a quiet confidence, closing the truck door gently before walking up her path. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, his expression serious but not unkind. "Miss Evans?" he asked. His voice was calm and clear. Clara's heart, which had been beating a slow, funereal rhythm, gave a nervous flutter. "Yes. Can I help you? My name is Ben Blackwood. My nephew is Kai. My uncle is Tahi." The names hung in the air, instantly changing the dynamic. This wasn't a stranger, this was family. She stood up from the swing. "Please," she said, gesturing to the other chair on the porch. "Please, sit." He nodded his thanks and took the seat, waiting for her to sit back down before he spoke again. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. "My uncle asked me to come speak with you. His English is, well, he prefers to let his actions speak." A small, wry smile touched his lips. Sometimes that doesn't translate so well. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. I understood. I think." Ben looked out toward the street for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "We heard what happened, about your job, about the meeting they want to have." News traveled fast, it seemed, across the invisible lines that divided their communities. "Tahi feels a great weight about this. He fears the honor he intended for you has become a burden." "A burden?" Clara shook her head, the motion emphatic. "No, it was the most powerful thing I've ever seen. But I don't think anyone else in this town saw it that way." "They saw what they wanted to see," Ben said simply. He then leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct and earnest. "I came to explain what they don't understand. When you stood for Kai, you did more than stop an angry man. In our way of seeing, you stood for our children. You stood for our elders. You showed a courage that many of our own people are afraid to show in these border towns. You did it without being asked, and you expected nothing in return." He gestured toward the inside of her house, where the hawk sat on her table. "The gift my uncle left you, the hawk, it's a messenger. It sees everything from above with a clear eye. It sees the truth of things. It is a symbol of great vision, of protection. It was his way of saying, 'We see you. We see your truth, and we will watch over you.'" Clara's eyes welled with tears. The cold, crushing weight of the town's judgment seemed to shrink in the face of his words. All the whispers, the stares, the formal letter, they were all based on a deliberate misinterpretation. And the men, Ben continued, his voice soft but firm, they were not there to intimidate. That was a procession of honor. It's not done lightly. It's to publicly declare that a person is respected, that they are under the protection of our community. It was a statement to anyone who would wish you harm. This person is our friend. An attack on her is an attack on us. It was the highest sign of respect Tahi and those men could give. She finally understood. It wasn't a threat, it was a shield. A shield the town had perceived as a sword. The irony was devastating. She wiped a tear from her cheek, feeling a strange mix of profound sorrow and fierce validation. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for telling me this. I felt so alone." "You are not alone," Ben said, his words a simple, solid fact. "Tahi wanted you to know that. We cannot fight this for you in their world, in their meeting room. They would not listen to us, but we will stand with you. If you wish it, my uncle and I will come to the hearing. We will not speak unless we are spoken to, but we will be there. So the board and the whole town can see that you do not stand alone." The offer was staggering. It wouldn't save her job. In fact, their presence might even seal her fate, confirming the board's narrative of her being a divisive element. But that no longer seemed to be the point. The battle had shifted. It was no longer about her career. It was about standing for a truth the hawk on her table represented. Clara looked from Ben's sincere face to the unyielding mountains and back. The loneliness that had haunted her for days was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. She was an outsider in Bridger's Gap, yes, but she was not without a community. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I would be honored if you would come." The school library had been stripped of its usual warmth. The colorful posters were gone, and the tables were arranged in a rigid, quasi-judicial formation. A long table for the 5-member school board sat at the front, facing a single, solitary chair for Clara. Rows of chairs for the public were packed, a clear line dividing the grimly supportive few, mostly younger teachers who avoided her gaze, and the larger, openly hostile crowd of parents and community members. The air was stale, thick with judgment and the low murmur of anticipation. Clara sat in the designated chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She focused on her breathing, a trick her therapist had taught her years ago. In, 2, 3. Out, 2, 3. It did little to quell the frantic drumming in her chest. Across from her, Principal Thompson fidgeted with his tie, his face a mask of strained neutrality. But the real locus of animosity was Jed Miller, who sat in the front row, flanked by his wife and a half-dozen other ranchers. His arms were crossed over his chest, his jaw set, his eyes boring into Clara with an expression of pure vindication. The board president, a hardware store owner named Mr. Henderson, banged a small gavel. This disciplinary hearing of the Bridger's Gap School District is now in session. The matter before us concerns the conduct of Miss Clara Evans, 4th grade teacher at Bridger's Gap Elementary. He cleared his throat, reading from a sheet of paper with bureaucratic detachment. The board has received a formal complaint, signed by 27 parents, alleging that Miss Evans engaged in unprofessional conduct, created a hostile public spectacle, and failed to maintain the political neutrality expected of an educator, thereby disrupting the peace of this community. We will first hear from the primary complainant, Mr. Jed Miller. Jed stood, his boots thudding heavily on the linoleum floor. He didn't address the board, but turned to face the room as if he were a politician rallying his base. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Folks, I'm a simple man. I run my ranch, I raise my family, and I try to live right. All I did was go into the market to buy feed. I see this. This man and his kid just standing there, blocking the aisle. I ask him to move politely." A murmur of agreement rippled through his supporters. "Next thing I know," he said, pointing a thick finger at Clara, "this teacher, who is paid by our tax dollars to teach our kids reading and writing, comes flying down the aisle, screaming at me, accusing me of things I didn't do, making a scene in front of the whole town." He paused, letting the lie settle in the heavy air. "She embarrassed me. She tried to make me out to be some kind of monster for just being a citizen. And then what happens?" He lowered his voice, infusing it with a sense of grave danger. "The next day, a whole gang of them shows up at her house. Dozens of them from the reservation. They just stood there, staring, menacing. What message does that send our kids? That if you don't like someone, you get your friends to go intimidate them. Is that what we're teaching now?" He turned back to the board. "She brought this on us. She's a troublemaker who puts her big city ideas ahead of the safety and values of our town. She's unfit to teach our children." He sat down to a smattering of applause, which Mr. Henderson quickly silenced with another rap of the gavel. "Miss Evans," Henderson said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Your response." Clara's legs felt like water as she stood. Her voice was a bare whisper at first. That's not what happened." She took a breath, finding a small anchor of strength in the memory of Ben's words. The hawk, truth. She looked directly at Jed. "You didn't ask them to move, Mr. Miller. You told a 10-year-old boy and his grandfather that they didn't belong there. You used a slur. You cornered a child. I didn't scream. I asked you to stop." She faced the board. "My job is to protect children. That job doesn't end when the school bell rings. I saw a child being bullied by an adult, and I did what any decent person should have done. I intervened." Her voice grew stronger, steadier. "As for the procession, you call it menacing. I've learned it was something else entirely. It was a gesture of honor, a silent thank you. It wasn't a threat. The only threat in this situation came from a grown man intimidating a child in a grocery store." The back door of the library swung open with a soft sigh. Every head turned. Ben entered first, his face calm and serious. He held the door for Tahi, who walked with the unhurried grace of a man completely at peace with his place in the world. Behind him, another 10 men from the reservation filed in. They were of all ages, from young men with long hair to elders with faces like carved river stones. They wore simple jeans and jackets, but they carried with them an immense, unshakable dignity. They didn't speak. They didn't make a single threatening gesture. They simply lined the back wall of the library, standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. The murmuring in the room died instantly, replaced by a stunned, electric silence. Jed Miller's face went pale, his bravado evaporating in the face of this silent, powerful testament. Mr. Henderson looked utterly flustered, staring at the men as if they were an apparition. Who are you people? This is a closed hearing." Ben stepped forward slightly, his voice clear and respectful. "We are relatives of the boy who Miss Evans defended. We were invited. We are here to listen." He stepped back in line. The men did not move. Their presence reshaped the entire room. They weren't an accusation. They were the truth, standing silently in judgment of the lies. Clara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She was not alone. She turned her head slightly and met Tahi's gaze from across the room. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough, it was everything. Mr. Henderson, his face now a blotchy red, hammered the gavel repeatedly. "Order, order. The board will take a 15-minute recess, to consider this development." He and the other board members practically fled into a side office, closing the door behind them. The room was left in a state of suspended animation. No one spoke. Jed Miller and his supporters seemed to shrink in their chairs, refusing to look toward the back wall. Clara remained standing, her fear replaced by a profound, grounding calm. The silent warriors had returned, not with threats, but with the unassailable power of their presence. The hearing was no longer just about her job. It was about the soul of the town itself. The silence that fell over the gymnasium during the recess was heavier than any shout had been. It was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone, thick with unspoken threats and simmering resentment. Clara stood by her designated table, her hands resting flat on its cool surface to keep them from shaking. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the vast, unnerving quiet. Across the room, Jed Miller and his supporters were a knot of agitated energy. They spoke in hushed, angry tones, casting venomous glances first at Clara, then at the stoic line of Northern Cheyenne men at the back of the room. They didn't understand the silence of Tahi and his people, mistaking it for weakness or intimidation, never recognizing it as what it was: unshakable strength. Ben stepped away from the group and moved to Clara's side. He didn't say anything at first, simply standing with her, a silent partner in the long, tense wait. His presence was a comfort, a solid anchor in the swirling sea of hostility. "They have put the board in a difficult position," Ben said, his voice low and calm, barely disturbing the air around them. "To fire you now is to publicly side against us. It is no longer just about a teacher and a rancher. They made it about the town. My grandfather, he made it about 2 nations." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at Tahi. The old man's gaze was fixed on the closed door to the deliberation room. His face was a mask of dignified patience, a testament to a people who had learned to wait through injustices far greater than this. His men stood with him, their posture relaxed but ready, their collective presence a powerful, silent testimony that needed no words. The door finally creaked open. Mr. Henderson and the 2 other board members emerged, their faces pale and drawn. Henderson walked to the podium, shuffling his papers with an air of profound reluctance. The rustling sound was unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the divided room, lingering for a moment on Jed's furious face before flicking to Tahi's impassive one. He seemed to shrink under the weight of those gazes. "The board has concluded its deliberation," Henderson began, his voice strained. This has been a complicated situation with strong feelings on all sides. We have taken into account the testimony of Mr. Miller and other parents, as well as the statement provided by Miss Evans. He paused, taking a deep breath. We have also noted the significant community interest in this matter. He was looking directly at the back of the room. Jed shifted on his feet, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. It is the finding of this board that while Miss Evans's intervention at the supermarket may have been unconventional, Henderson chose his words with excruciating care. There is no evidence of professional misconduct that warrants termination. The accusations of inciting aggression are unsubstantiated. A wave of relief washed over Clara so intensely that her knees felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table. Therefore, Miss Evans will retain her position as a teacher at Bridger's Gap Elementary. The words hung in the air for a second before the room erupted. A raw, guttural roar of fury came from Jed Miller. Unsubstantiated? Are you blind? She brought a threat down on this town, on our children. His supporters echoed his outrage, shouting and rising to their feet. But Henderson held up a hand, his voice gaining a sliver of authority. However, we are issuing a formal reprimand to be placed in Miss Evans's file regarding the need for de-escalation and communication through official channels. The situation could have been handled with more discretion. It was a compromise, a bureaucratic appeasement designed to give Jed's faction something, a token victory to soothe their wounded pride. But it was meaningless. Clara had her job. That was the only thing that mattered. Discretion, Jed spat the word. This isn't over, Henderson. You and this board have made your choice. You've sided with them against your own people. He jabbed a finger not at Clara, but towards Tahi. You'll regret this. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the gymnasium, his posse of angry ranchers and their wives following in his wake like a tide of resentment. The gym doors swung shut behind them, leaving a silence that was, for the first time, tinged with peace. Mr. Henderson, looking utterly drained, tapped the microphone. This hearing is adjourned. He and the other board members practically fled the room. Slowly, the remaining townspeople began to file out, their expressions a mixture of relief, curiosity, and lingering apprehension. A few cast furtive, almost respectful glances at Clara. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just the outsider teacher. When the room was nearly empty, Tahi and his men began to move. They walked not towards the exit, but towards Clara. She watched them approach, her breath catching in her chest. Tahi stopped before her, his dark, ancient eyes holding hers. He had the same profound dignity he'd carried in the supermarket, but now there was something else in his gaze, a deep, resounding respect. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He simply raised his hand and gave her a single, slow nod. It was the same gesture from the store, but this time it held 1,000 times the weight. It was an acknowledgement of a battle won, of a debt recognized. It was a promise. Ben stood beside him. "Thank you, Clara Evans," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that touched her soul. "You stood for one of us. Today, we stood for you. The path may not be easy from here. Men like Jed Miller do not forget." "I know," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse, "but I'm not afraid." And in that moment, she realized it was true. The fear that had lived in her stomach since the confrontation had vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She had faced down the town's anger, and with the silent backing of these honorable men, she had won. Tahi nodded once more to her, then turned. With the same silent, unified grace with which they had arrived, he and his men walked out of the gymnasium, their footsteps the only sound. They faded into the brilliant Montana afternoon, leaving Clara Evans alone in the echoing space, no longer an outsider, but a part of something far older and stronger than the town of Bridger's Gap itself. The days following the hearing settled into a fragile, deceptive quiet. The tension in Bridger's Gap hadn't vanished. It had simply submerged, lurking beneath the surface of daily pleasantries. Some townsfolk, who had previously averted their gazes, now offered Clara tentative smiles or a brief, clipped hello. Others, loyal to Jed Miller's version of reality, still looked through her, their silence a testament to the town's deep-seated division. Clara felt like she was walking on a frozen lake, acutely aware of the fissures spreading unseen beneath her feet. The real change was in the quiet acknowledgments. Ben Blackwood would pass her on the street, his usual stoicism replaced by a warm, respectful nod. One afternoon, Kai shyly handed her a drawing of a soaring eagle. Its wings spread wide over a small, protected schoolhouse. It was a gesture more powerful than any words, a silent affirmation that she was no longer alone. The reprimand from the school board felt like a hollow echo against the weight of this newfound, unspoken alliance. She had kept her job, but more importantly, she had earned something far more valuable. But peace built on a foundation of resentment is a fragile thing. Jed Miller was a man whose pride was his entire identity, and it had been publicly shattered. He couldn't accept the outcome of the hearing. He couldn't accept the sight of Tahi's men standing tall while he was made to look small. The quiet in town was, for him, a simmering cauldron of humiliation. His rage finally boiled over on a cold Thursday afternoon, when the Montana sky was a vast, unforgiving gray. The first snow of the season had been threatening for days, and the air had a sharp, metallic bite. School had just let out, and Clara was gathering her things when she noticed Kai's mother, Lena, waiting for him by her old, rust-pocked sedan. A sudden, chilling premonition made Clara pause by her classroom window. She saw Jed Miller's gleaming Ford F-250 parked across the street, engine idling, its dark-tinted windows like a predator's eyes. Lena and Kai got into their car and pulled away, heading east toward the reservation. A moment later, Jed's truck lurched from the curb and followed them. A cold dread, far sharper than the autumn air, seized Clara. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an escalation. Without a second thought, she grabbed her keys and coat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw her bag onto the passenger seat of her own car and sped out of the parking lot, pushing her small vehicle to keep the two cars in sight. She followed them out of town, onto the long, lonely stretch of asphalt that gave way to the gravel road leading to northern Cheyenne lands. About 2 miles down the gravel road, flanked by barren fields and skeletal cottonwood trees, the scene she had feared unfolded. Jed's truck had swerved in front of Lena's car, forcing it to a sudden, dusty halt. He was out of his vehicle, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands, their bodies silhouetted against the pale, oppressive sky. They weren't touching the car, but their presence was an impassable wall. Clara pulled her car to a stop about 50 yards back, the crunch of gravel under her tires sounding impossibly loud in the silence. She got out, her legs unsteady but her resolve hardening into steel. She could see Lena's frightened face through the windshield and Kai huddled beside her. "Miller," Clara's voice was sharp, cutting through the wind. "Leave them alone." Jed turned slowly, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his lips. "Well, look what we have here. The school teacher coming to the rescue again. This isn't your business, Evans. This is a private conversation." "It looks like harassment to me," Clara shot back, walking closer. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. "Get back in your truck and go home." "I think we'll stay," one of his hands sneered, taking a step forward. "This town needs a lesson about who's in charge." Just as Jed opened his mouth to reply, a new sound began to permeate the air. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, the sound of engines and heavy tires on gravel. Jed and his men turned, their smirks faltering. Over the crest of the hill behind Clara, a line of pickup trucks appeared. 1, then 3, then 5, then more than a dozen. They were the weathered, hardworking trucks of the reservation. Fords, Chevys, Dodges, and they moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. They fanned out, creating a wide, silent semicircle that blocked the road completely, trapping Jed's truck in a pincer of steel and silent intent. The truck doors opened in near unison. Tahi emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Ben Blackwood and dozens of other men. They didn't shout. They didn't brandish weapons. They simply stood by their trucks, their arms crossed, their faces carved from the same stoic patience they had shown at the hearing. Their collective gaze was fixed on Jed Miller, and in their silence was a power that dwarfed any loud threat he could ever make. Jed's face went pale. The bravado drained from him, replaced by a primal, cornered animal fear. The two ranch hands shuffled backward, their eyes wide, suddenly understanding the catastrophic miscalculation they had made. Tahi walked forward, his steps measured and unhurried. He stopped a few feet from Jed, his presence seeming to suck the very air from around them. He looked not at Jed, but at Lena's car, at his grandson's face pressed against the window. Then his dark eyes settled on Jed Miller. "You have brought trouble to my family twice," Tahi said, his voice low and calm, yet it carried across the gravel with absolute authority. "You have threatened a woman who showed courage when others showed cowardice. She is a friend to our people. An attack on her, or an attack on this child, is an attack on all of us." He swept a hand back toward the silent line of men. "This will not happen a third time. You will leave this road. You will leave them in peace. You will never trouble them again. Do you understand?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Jed, utterly defeated, could only manage a jerky, terrified nod. He stumbled back to his truck, his cronies scrambling in after him. He maneuvered the large vehicle in a clumsy, multi-point turn and sped away, leaving a plume of dust in his wake. The silence that remained was different. It was calm, protective. The men began to disperse, their trucks rumbling back toward the reservation as quietly as they had arrived. The favor had been returned, not with violence, but with an undeniable show of unity that had shattered Jed Miller's power for good. Lena got out of her car, her body trembling with relief, and pulled Clara into a fierce hug. Kai ran to his grandfather, who lifted him into his arms. Tahi walked over to Clara, his grandson still held tight. For the first time, a genuine, warm smile touched his lips. "You have a strong heart, Clara Evans," he said, his voice filled with a deep, profound respect. "You showed our people what courage is. Today, we wanted to show you what family is." Weeks later, the snow finally came, blanketing Bridger's Gap in a thick layer of white, muffling old noises and resentments. The story of the standoff on the gravel road had spread through town, not as a tale of menace, but as one of quiet, unshakable strength. Jed Miller was a diminished figure, his influence withered. The town, forced to witness the truth, began to change. The line between us and them had blurred. Clara stood at her classroom window, watching the children play in the snow. Kai was in the middle of it all, laughing, his place among them now unquestioned. She saw Tahi's truck pull up across the street. He didn't get out. He just looked toward the school, toward her window, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Clara smiled and nodded back. She was no longer an outsider, no longer just a teacher. She was a bridge built not of wood or stone, but of courage, respect, and a favor returned.